Okay, hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining this discussion as part of Thrive London's World Mental Health Day Festival 2021 in partnership with the Mayor of London's peer outreach team. My name's Camila Royal. I'm a teacher and researcher. I'm based at the London School of Economics in central London. And as someone with a real interest in the environment and how it relates to mental health, I'm really happy to be part of this discussion this evening. So I am joined here at the Rich Mix by two guests, Noga Levy-Rapoport, who is a climate justice activist, a volunteer and organiser with UK Student Climate Network, and also by Kismet Meyon. Kismet is a youth and human rights activist, someone who's involved in some really interesting research about COP26 and young Londoners' concerns. And I think we'll probably end up talking a bit more about COP26, UN climate talks that are happening in Britain, in Glasgow, in not much more than a month's time now. So it's a really kind of interesting time to be talking about climate change. So and for this Never Alone London conversation, we'll start by asking whether we feel like young people are a lone voice in discussions about climate change and what kind of burdens that puts on young people. And wherever you're watching this conversation, you can join through social media and use the hashtag #NeverAloneLondon or #NeverAlone LDN to join in that way. So I will start by allowing our guests to introduce themselves. Noga, I'll start with you. Could you explain to us how you got involved in climate activism and what kind of things you've been involved in?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me and introducing us. I'm Noga Levy-Rapoport. I'm 19 years old. I'm a climate activist, and I've been involved with organising the youth climate strikes in the UK and working on climate campaigns from a grassroots to an international scale over the past 2.5 years, ranging from working on systemic change around campaigns like the Green New Deal to curriculum reform in the way we teach climate change, the way we think about mental health and climate change and eco-anxiety, to pushing for kind of youth empowerment at all ages, really, as much as I can. And I've kind of been working on that continuously and developing as much as I can new methods of creative storytelling around the climate crisis, how we can uplift each other to push for political justice in as many forms of equity as we can find, and how we can centre justice in everything that we do.
Wow, that's amazing. Very similar to what I do, but I haven't done it for 2.5 years. And it's incredible that you're only 19 and you're doing such amazing work. So you did a great introduction. Thank you, Camilla. So I'm a human rights activist, an advocate for young people. And I have been involved in some amazing research that we've been holding off the back of some research that we started in 2017 with Professor James Salome from Royal Holloway University. So the peer outreach team has been heavily involved in trying to understand how we can make London a little bit more sustainable, the key concerns of young Londoners around environmental issues and mental health, air quality and air pollution, the fears and anxieties of school kids having to travel, uni students having to travel. There's an extensive amount of research being done, and it's being continued. And we're just looking forward to keep running the focus groups and hearing the views of young Londoners.
Great. It doesn't seem like either of you have been involved in activism that long compared to some people. Wait till you get to sort of, 16 years and more. It can be a long journey sometimes. But I'd be still interested to hear, how you think things have changed since you first got involved in these movements. Maybe firstly from you, Noga.
Climate conversations, I think, have changed majorly, and to an extent, I think I would like to credit kind of the work we did around the climate strikes to that. I think we can see massive changes in the way climate and the way we talk about it has been approached by the media, and in schools and by the people around us. I think there is a new and added urgency to so many of those conversations that we didn't really have before, that we wouldn't expect to see before. And that, I think, is a really dramatic change. I think a lot of these movements as well have begun to respect the voices of young people a little bit more. I kind of remember being like 14, 15 and doing a little bit of grassroots activism in my community and not feeling that young people were being centred in movements for change, which is, very surprising considering that historically we've always kind of been at the forefront. We've always, used our own kind of naivety and optimism to keep us going and to maintain that integrity that is so needed for social justice movements. But I think there has been such a huge and dramatic change in how, in particular, young people address social and political justice. I think the pandemic has also shown us that, and in so many ways we've all been radicalized a little more, or at least have opened up to the idea of more radical action and genuine kind of transformational change.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we've definitely been exposed to a lot more of the truth and what's going on and the issues at hand. And I think social media has played a really great tool in making the conversation more accessible for everyone, because from a lot of the research that we've done with the young Londoners, we've realised with the young Londoners, with young Londoners, we've realised that there is a massive discrepancy in the voice of climate change, and there's a lot of communities that don't necessarily get to voice their opinion in climate change, and it seems to be that the climate crisis and the voice of the climate crisis tends to be quite a white middle class voice, and that was something that really, people wanted to address, because it's about involving everyone in making sure that everyone can actually play their part in helping to, save the planet, save our world. But yeah, social media was a massive tool in making it more accessible for other people to have a voice as well.
Yeah, maybe following on from that, do you think things like social media, have they made it feel like more of a global movement? Do you feel more connected with other activists in other parts of the world, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, and I'm sure you'll agree on this, which is that when kind of organising on any scale, the connections we were able to make, whether that was through organising climate strikes or other demonstrations, on an absolutely global scale. And so much of what we did was literally done through communicating on social media, was done through reaching out to activists across all parts of the world and learning from kind of those much older than us who had come before us, and using social media and the nature of social media that is this kind of endless archive of photos and videos that you can use to inspire yourself and to mobilise and inspire others, was a huge asset in organising all of those things. I don't think that means there aren't pitfalls of social media. I think very often people talk about performative activism and kind of, the infographic risks and pitfalls of that. And I think those are real risks, and there are ways to avoid that. But there are also incredible ways to use social media to celebrate the best parts of social justice movements and to keep mobilizing and galvanizing and energizing and pushing ourselves forward. And I think it was such a huge asset for so many people who couldn't have got involved beforehand, who were able to see demonstrators kind of displayed across their feeds at all times. And it really has hugely assisted in how many people we were able to mobilize and get involved, and how many young people were able to think creatively about the different ways they could get involved and work around traditionally more inaccessible parts of justice movements through that kind of digital space, and reach out into online workspaces and online channels to continue building that movement and change, those who are suffering from apathy into those who really want to take action.
You said it all. I completely agree. I completely agree with that.
It's made it in some ways easier to hear from and, even contact activists in, I follow people in Twitter from South Asia, from Africa, when Vanessa Nakato's on social media and people like that. I think it does make it feel a bit more global. So I guess, being young people, you talked a little bit about people starting to listen to young people. I feel like young people, when they talk about climate change, you have, in some ways, a kind of moral authority. You can say, this is our future. Greta Thunberg talks about how she feels like older people have let her down and have, not left her much prospect of a future, kind of thing. So I think, but do you feel like, as young people, do you feel like you have a certain authority with people? Does that make sense?
No. At the end of the day, I feel like a lot of young people have been voicing their opinion for a long time, but it's down to decision makers to actually listen and put the solutions into place. There's only so much we can do we've just about got bank accounts. Do you know what I mean? So it's like the people in position and with power need to be actually taking on the recommendations that young people are coming up with, because from the focus groups and stuff that I've done, there are some amazing recommendations in turning London into a more sustainable city. We're like the worst polluted city, I think, in Europe, which is quite shocking. And I think we need to do more about it for our own safety. I have asthma. I worry all the time about my health and the costs of my asthma pump. And there's so much that we worry about, but no one really takes no one takes that into consideration when we're talking to decision makers and stuff like, you know, what are you actually going to do about it? So in general, I feel like we we have platforms where we can have our voices shared and we can network in that, but it's really down to, yeah, governments actually taking on what we say and large corporate organisations genuinely being held accountable.
I'd absolutely agree with that. And I think, like, it's exhausting all the time. It's so tiring to, on the one hand, you know, you're told that you're a child who's too optimistic and too idealistic, and, you know, your visualizations of what world we can actually achieve and what future that is safer and more equitable and more sustainable that we want to dream of is, you know, so far off the table and it's stupid to think about. And on the other hand, we're constantly told that, you know, we're inspiring young people and we're changing the world and, you know, we're all going to be huge politicians and decision makers one day. And it's exhausting because none of that is leading to, you know, any actual fundamental, transformative change. And I think then also on this idea of young people wanting a future, I think for a really long time we have tried to appeal to that kind of side of the moral authority. And I think in some cases it's worked. In some cases it has gained young people a lot of access to spaces that we didn't have before. On the other hand, I think, and whilst I'm guilty of kind of using that argument before, I do think there are issues with constantly appealing to this kind of better future when, you know, for climate change has been a reality, not a far off distant thing for the last 40 years. And the kind of neglect and active erasure of so many activists across the world from so much of our history and so much of our politics, whether that's on behalf of corporations or governments, has really led to this idea that, you know, we're the first wave of young people saying anything. It's only happened in the past few years. It's all Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future. And, you know, it's not just us. And if there weren't, you know, hundreds of thousands of activists and defenders who'd come before us and who'd fought so hard for that, we wouldn't have that. And so I don't think it's, you know, just on young people asking for this future. It's about recognizing that climate change comes from all these discrepancies that we're struggling with now. It's coming from all these inequities that are so baked into our systems. And if we want to tackle that, we have to recognize that everyone has an equal share in this future, in this better world, and we deserve that reality.
It shouldn't just be young people having to advocate on it, basically. And like what you said, there was people before us who were young and they advocated, and they're still advocating, but they're not young, so now we're the new generation. It's like an ongoing thing, you know what I mean? So it's like, it's about time something actually happens rather than just letting people talk. Like, you know, we're fed up of talking.
Yeah, absolutely.
Action is necessary now.
Yeah, and it's such a collective responsibility to advocate for climate change. And that's, I totally agree. Like, everyone has a role to play in pushing for that element of justice and resolving the climate crisis. And I think the only places where we risk going wrong with that is just where people take this idea of collective responsibility and think it means collective contribution, which of course isn't entirely accurate, in that we all have a role to play in pushing for climate justice, but that doesn't mean we're all equally at fault for it. And that's, again, the kind of this argument that keeps getting pushed onto young people, which is like, well, if you care about climate change so much, why don't you go vegan? Why don't you take 5-minute showers? Why don't you, you know, totally sink down your own carbon footprint? Where it's like, just because we're advocating for change doesn't mean that we each have that exact same role to play, because my 19 years of, you know, living in London aren't the same as 19 years of Shell, like, terrorizing people across the world in the search for fossil fuels, you know. So that's also kind of all these things that young people have to fight and push for all the time, and it makes it so exhausting and tiring for us all the time.
Yeah. And one thing that really irritated me is, like, someone was like, oh, look at these protesters, they've probably driven to get to the protest. fair enough, I understand if it was like someone just driving down, but the thing is people need to understand that people have different accessibilities. Maybe that person was disabled, maybe that is their only form of transport, maybe there isn't, you know, public transport that's accessible for them. So I think it's about people really understanding other people's situations in life and why they're advocating for this, and realising it's a crisis that involves all of us. It's not just like an individual, oh, it's young people's future or whatnot. It's literally, it's the problem that we all are facing.
Yeah, absolutely, couldn't agree more.
Yeah, so you've spoken really well about how this kind of burden is sometimes put onto the shoulders of young people. So what kind of action do you want to see? What do you want to see more of from older people and I guess from governments as well?
Well, do you want to
go for it, you go.
I think, you know, there are lots of policies and solutions that are floating around. I think it would be wrong to attempt to instate some sort of international blanket solution. Most countries have hugely different contributions to kind of the fossil fuel economy and the industries. Lots of different countries across the world are in different positions in terms of what change they're able to implement and how much change they actually need to implement. I think in the UK, lots of us have been focusing on ideas like the Green New Deal, or often rebranded as kind of the Green Industrial Revolution, and a lot of different policies. And what that means is kind of pushing for total decarbonisation across our economy, whilst also maintaining and actually pushing through hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of green jobs in renewable sectors, and what we kind of tend to term a just transition. And that's, I know, a term that's been picked up in America as well over the past few years. And that is really about ensuring that no one gets left behind. You know, if we want to make a move to totally renewable sectors, then we have to embrace the fact that lots of people do work in fossil fuel sectors. Lots of people's livelihood relies on that. And the government and the state has a responsibility to ensure that when we, I'm saying when because I'm praying that it's not an if, when we get to carbon zero, we have done it in a way that ensures that people have green and well-paid and secure jobs that can, you know, maintain our own lifestyles to a reasonable extent without falling into overconsumption. And we're able to ensure that everyone is you know, safe and comfortable in this more equitable future, that we're able to tackle different discrepancies across our society, that we're able to deal with systemic issues, that we're able to expand public infrastructure so that everyone has access across the most even rural parts of England to kind of buses and rail that is free and or cheap and accessible to all. And really centering this idea of equity in our system. I know I kind of keep throwing that around, but to me it's the most important factor of climate justice, and it's the one that recognises that the UK has a historic responsibility in this crisis. It's kind of hundreds of years of extractivism of people and planet, and that culture have brought us to where we are today. It's brought us to this tipping point, and we have the policies and solutions to change all that, and that requires a total, fundamental, transformative change of our economy and of our society, and that requires real state and government, you know, willpower to make that happen. And hopefully, I know we'd spoken about briefly earlier, or you mentioned COP26, and hopefully that's what we'll see. Although I'm not hugely optimistic about that.
I mean, yeah, I don't think. I mean, it's a shame because it seems like a lot of Londoners. Young Londoners' views haven't really been put at the forefront of this whole thing either, which is why we're doing the work we're doing to make sure young Londoners are heard. And just even trying to get our foot in the door for COP26 has just been really difficult. But we're still going to be hosting events around on the 5th of November, which will be their Youth Empowerment Day, to make sure young people are empowered and feel involved in the conversation. But going back to the question around what the governments could do, a lot of what you said I completely agree with. But like electric cars and that, just make it more accessible, like have a scheme where people could trade in their petrol cars or whatnot, you know, try actually encourage people to like go green rather than make everything so expensive, because that's the case right now. Everything's just ridiculously expensive. But yeah, I think the governments could do way, way, way more. And I'll always have that argument in terms of like, you know, large corporates getting away with so much wastage, and they tokenistically will just like replace their plastic straws for like cardboard ones, and then, you know what I mean, but they're still creating so much wastage that you don't see. So I think, yeah, they really need to be held accountable, and it's about time they do so.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think on kind of the topic of corporations as well, that's that's a real risk that we're facing, and it's something that we also need to see. We need to see corporations held accountable, and we need to see like a very clear and transparent process around regulations, because what we're at risk of right now is such huge levels of greenwashing that I think we're seeing so much of. We're seeing, so many like corporations, like even the idea of like the carbon footprint, which I think BP invented like 2001 or something, that was like this idea of you all have to, take individual responsibility for the climate crisis. And all greenwashing does, all this idea of, oh, we'll pay more for vegan products, pay more for an electric car than you would for a diesel car is just driving this inaccessibility upwards and upwards, and it just creates a much wider gap between those who can afford to live within the constraints of climate change and those who are kind of getting kicked to the curb, as so many of us who live in London are, and so many young people in particular are, who have, no prospects and no future and no chance at getting anything back out of this. We just constantly need to see this action from governments and from policymakers and from decision makers, cracking down on corporations, cracking down on that corporate kind of tyrannical power that we've been facing for so long, and recognising that that is the root of our problems, that is where the climate crisis is born of, and we need, to really see the end of that kind of corporate elite within the fossil fuel industry.
Thanks. I think you've both spoken really well about the need to challenge these big corporations, and the need to not just keep blaming individuals and not treat it as just a problem of needing to stop using plastic straws or whatever. I think because it's World Mental Health Day, I think there was a recent survey of 10,000 young people from all over the world. I think you might have come across it, where they found that I think 60% of people felt very worried or extremely worried about climate change, 16 to 25-year-old age range. I know you've both done research in this area. Do you have any further thoughts about the relationship between climate change and mental health, among young people?
Just going back to the topic of health, financial costs to prescriptions, that's costing money. Just general fears and anxieties that as you get older, your lung capacity, everything, there's so much at risk just living in London. The fact that in 2013 we lost a 9-year-old girl in Lewisham, things like that, and we're in 2021 now, you're thinking by now we should have, a better place or a better city to at least have better air quality, but it doesn't seem like we're going down that direction. It seems like we're going down an opposite direction. And I'm just going to say, a lot of young people have a lot of anxieties and fears. There's no proper green spaces to go and actually, just feel the air and, just enjoy the environment because it's all polluted. The anxieties are very high.
Yeah, I think, I haven't done formal research on this, but I do think that young people's greatest asset is our energy and our excitement, and it's what we bring to so many spaces and so many movements. But eco-anxiety is kind of the exact antithesis to that. It's paralyzing. It leaves so many young people in such a difficult position where you feel like you can't do anything, and anything that you can do, it's never enough. Because you're told constantly you're so responsible for everything that's wrong with the world, and if you tried to fix anything about it, doesn't matter anyway because it's all going to collapse, and climate change is totally inevitable and we have no future and it's all apocalyptic. And that's terrifying. I found out about climate change when I was 6 years old, and we were basically told that the only way to solve any of it was to get our dads to stop using aerosol cans when they were shaving. And that was it. That was literally all we were told. And so for basically the next 10 years of my life, I just thought we had this inevitable void in our future that eventually, to kind of get over the anxiety around that, I literally just had to accept it. And that's awful. That's an awful kind of space to live in. And I was so happy to find that kind of comradeship around so many other young people who did want to act on climate justice and social justice and change the world around us. And that uplifted me so much. But if we don't embrace nature around us through green spaces, if we don't see urgent action, if we don't, think about the fact that I think it's over a fifth of schools in London are susceptible to flooding, and young people are constantly choking on kind of our polluted air. Like you mentioned the case of Ella, the girl who died in 2013. That's only very recently in the last couple of years kind of been declared as, a death that was caused because of dangerous and illegal levels of air pollution that is, directly tied to the climate crisis. These are very real fears that young people have all the time. And of course, we're not alone in fearing those things. We're also not alone in acting in it. But the more we're pushed to the side and the more our voices are ignored or kind of vaguely like tucked to the side at very, very important spaces like COP26 and in places of power and decision making, then the harder it gets to keep going. And I think it's on all of us to constantly uplift each other and constantly remind each other that we have changed the world before. We've changed the world many, many times over hundreds and thousands of years. We've seen huge and dramatic systemic transformational change, and we can do that again. We just need to keep ramping up our efforts very literally to bring kind of demonstrations and protests to an unprecedented scale, to push ourselves into spaces where we haven't been allowed into before, and to uplift every single person around us all the time. Otherwise, we won't get anywhere.
Right, you've kind of touched on my next question, really, about, you know, how do you cope with that eco-anxiety? You've talked about involvement in the movement. Is there anything else about, have any other ideas about how people can try and cope with this?
Yeah, I can jump in. Personally, you touched on like having different creative mediums to sort of relay the message. I'm all for that. I think being able to share your anxieties and fears through film production or through a spoken word piece or something creative where it doesn't just speak to someone like, just like, you know, it doesn't just speak to their mind, but it really speaks to their soul, and, you know, people can really understand where you're coming from and what your anxieties and fears are. And I think just empowering more young people to do that, giving more young people the platform to do that, to talk about possible solutions, and just listening to the youth, listening to what they actually recommend and trying to genuinely put that into practice, and to just stop the tokenism, like genuinely bring in people from the communities and not just have a COP26 and say, yes, Youth Empowerment Day, but let's not ask any young Londoner anything, you know what I mean? So I think having real conversations and taking it to higher places and just empowering young people in whatever creative way possible.
Yeah, literally couldn't put it better myself. Yeah,
great. How do you think the pandemic has affected the movement? I know, you know, it's taking people off the streets for a little bit, but do you think it's also kind of made people more aware of the kind of crisis that we're in? Has it meant people have you know, seen the links between health and the environment a bit more? What are your thoughts?
Can I just say, I feel like the pandemic was just like this massive plaster onto the world, like just in a way kind of healed the world from a bit, because it was just like next to no human activity taking planes, like driving cars, polluting our beautiful earth. And I think that was quite nice just to see things that I'd never seen before, like, you know, in China, like that, the skyrise, it was never seen before because it was so polluted. And then to be able to see that was just so powerful, because it's like, hold up, when we just step back for a sec and stop like damaging and prodding and provoking our earth, you can see how it flourishes. And I do think it actually did make people wake up and be like, whoa, hang on, like this isn't normal. But yeah, I think it did.
Yeah, I think there was this element of like, this is a moment to step back and reassess. I think just in terms of eco-anxiety and burnout, for me personally, pandemic was a huge moment in which we could say, well, you know, we have to slow down, we have to reassess how much of our work is going in a productive way, what direction we want to take our organising in, what we want to do next. But on top of that, I think the pandemic was also a microcosm of kind of the dangers to come. And I kind of hate the term microcosm because, of course, the pandemic wasn't micro. Of course, it was devastating on a macro scale. And of course, it was a horrific time, and in many ways, it's still ongoing. And I think it has shown us just how unprepared we are for even greater consequences of the climate crisis. It's shown us how gaps of social and economic equity and income widen whenever there is a crisis, how those gaps are not being adequately closed, how there is not enough support and funding for so many of our communities, how even though, you know, so many places in London are thriving all the time, there are so many of our communities that are just suffering constantly. I live right under Grenfell, and we haven't seen any change in the last 4 years, and we didn't see a lot of change before that either. You know, these are parts of London where we're sort of very much hidden from the limelight, and those inequities constantly, those social injustices just become greater and greater with every crisis. We saw that with the pandemic, and we're going to see it on an unimaginable scale as the climate crisis gets worse and worse. And I think that did open up a lot of people's eyes to what urgent action was needed and how huge of a scale we need that action to be on in order to tackle this properly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to kind of draw it to a close right around now, but I just want to give you, an opportunity to add any last thoughts, particularly if there's anything coming up around COP, any actions that you think young people should be part of. What do you think? What are you going to be doing around COP, and what do you think young people should be getting involved in?
Okay, well, I might as well plug this event. So if you want to come along and have your voice heard, we're hoping to do a virtual meeting around COP26 in the Youth Empowerment event, which will be on the 5th of November. Details are yet to be confirmed. But email me, so my first name, this might be a bit long. So K for Kilo, I for India, S for Sierra, M for Mother, E for Echo, T for Tango, dot, N for Mother, E for Echo, Y for Yankee, O for Oscar, M for November, at london.gov.uk, and just subject it COP26. Just to quickly plug, we've got a Future Shapers network, so we're looking for as many young people to come and join, have your voice heard, and have a stake in your future. Yeah, cool.
Absolutely. Yeah, turning up to as many events as you can is really great. On the 5th of November, because it is Youth Empowerment Day, there are kind of strikes and demonstrations taking place, not just at Glasgow, but all around the country. I will be up in Glasgow for a few days, doing some stuff in the Green Zone and kind of being at that demonstration. And I think we're all hoping that something will come out of it. I think it's important to stay optimistic even when, that realism starts to creep in, even when we know that the leaders we have in charge across the world are not committed on the scale that we need them to be. But it's important that we're present at as many events as possible, as many demonstrations as possible, and we're kind of reclaiming our spaces in our streets as much as we can, to remind everyone that young people are not going away anytime soon, and that when politicians make decisions that condemn our generation to a lifetime of volatile ecological chaos, we will not, leave that doorstep. We will continue to stand there, and we will demand to be taken seriously. And I think for so many young people, that is just about recognizing that you shouldn't need to feel, especially when it is about mental health and when it is about feeling so trapped and anxious in yourself, you should never feel the need that you have to kind of ask permission or defer to others in order to make the change that you want to see in the world or act on what you feel is right. And I think that's not just something that can be pushed forward around COP, but it's something that young people around the world really need to know and understand. It's crucial, and there's never been a time where it's more imperative that young people everywhere kind of rise up and take to the streets and recognize just how much impact we can make as a generation and as a collective. And we can embrace that organizing power, and we can aim for new heights all the time.
I'll just say one more thing. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice, and everywhere. That's a well-known quote. So just keep that in mind, and fight for our future, fight for your rights.
Brilliant. I think that's a great note to end on. I think it's a topic that we could talk about for much longer. So many different elements to it, but that's all we have time for this evening. So please join me in thanking both our speakers, Noga Levy-Rapoport, Kismet, Meyon. Thank you both.
Thank you, Thrive London.
Thank you very much.